Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at GW. And we are absolutely delighted today to have two scholars join us to talk about refugees in Middle East history and the Middle East in refugee history. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I'd like to thank Christian Clinton and Elad Raymond for all their work organizing and publicizing this event. And so we are joined by Benjamin Thomas White, who's senior lecturer in history at the University of Glasgow. He's a Middle East historian who teaches refugee history in the world at large, and his research focuses on the history of the refugee camp with recent projects on the history of humanitarian evacuations and the relationship between humans and animals in displacement. Thanks so much, Benjamin, for joining us. And then we've got Laura Robson, who's the William and Donna Oliver McCourtney Professor of History at Penn State University. She's a scholar of the Middle East and an international historian. Her work focuses on the politics of ethnicity and religion in the 20th century Arab world, local, regional, and global reverberations of international governance and international law, and modern histories of mass violence. She's written at least 3 books, most recently co-editor of a book that we did a launch for, actually, I think it was 2 years ago now, States of Separation, Transfer, Partition, and the Making of the Modern Middle East. And her most recent, that was her most recent monograph. The book that we did the event on was actually called Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century Separatism, with our very own GW professor, Ari Dubnov. She's currently working on a new book that identifies Franklin Roosevelt's M Project, a scheme to identify empty spaces around the globe where racially undesirable refugee populations might be settled en masse. So thank you both so much for joining us today. As some of you know, the format for the event is a conversation between the two scholars. So Dr. Robson is actually going to be sort of leading the conversation with Dr. White, and the Associate Director, Shana Marshall, will be the moderator for the discussion portion after the conversation. So with no further ado, Dr. Robson, you can go ahead and begin. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation with Ben, whose work has been really crucial in helping us rethink the place of refugees in Middle Eastern history, but also the place of the Middle East in refugee history, as the title of this event suggests. So I thought we could start off with a question about periodization, which is actually quite an important issue in refugee history. You know, I think far too often refugee history has been conceived of as something that starts in the Second World War and really kind of ramps up with the articulation of international legal structures in the aftermath of 1945. And Ben has shown us that there's a prehistory to this, right? That refugee history actually begins much earlier, and that the Middle East is a kind of locus of it. His work tries to stretch refugee history back into the First World War and the dislocations that surrounded the dissolution of the major land-based empires, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and especially, of course, the Ottoman Empire. And Ben, you also really suggest the centrality of the Middle East as a region to the emergence of these modern refugee regimes and politics, which is something that has been very important in rethinking the field. So I want to start by pressing you on the question of whether we could actually go even further back if we're looking at the Middle East. That is there a continuity between the kinds of displacements and resettlements that your work starts with in the aftermath of the First World War, and perhaps the Ottoman and Balkan displacements and resettlements that happened in the decades prior to the First World War, from the late 19th century onwards? So in other words, I want to start by asking you, when we talk about modern refugee history, should we actually be starting even before the dawn of the European colonial occupations in places like Syria and Palestine and Iraq?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks, Monia and Shana, for inviting me. Laura, this is a really important question, and the answer, or to both those questions you just posed, is emphatically yes. So in the articles that I was asked to kind of think about, that I've recently published, that I was asked to think about for today, as you say, I've tried to push origins of our understanding of key aspects of modern refugee history back into the years around the First World War. With the refugee camp, there's often an assumption that it emerged when people recognize that it didn't emerge as late as the 1980s, which some people occasionally say in print, that it didn't emerge after the population displacements of the Second World War, but is already there in a recognizable form, capable of hosting 50,000 people, like the camp at Baquba, right after the First World War. Humanitarian evacuation, the examples that have typically been given as the historical precedents for this, if you only look at child evacuations, tend to go back to the late 1930s, but the evacuation of a general population of Armenians, tens of thousands of them, from Cilicia in 1921, obviously means we need to think about that much earlier, and think about the way long-range population displacement became normalized, and also the logistical techniques that could underpin it were developed and ready for deployment by the time of the First World War. That's not to say I think the First World War is where it starts. You're absolutely right that we need to move our understanding further back, at least into the late 19th, early 20th century, to understand the origins of modern refugee history. When I say modern refugee history, I'm talking about some of the specific aspects of 20th century and 21st century refugee history that allow us to differentiate between modern refugee history and earlier histories of displacement. The legal category in international law of refugee emerges after the First World War in the early 1920s, around Armenians displaced from their homeland in the Ottoman Empire and left stateless by the disappearance of that empire, and around Russians displaced from the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution and left stateless by the decree of the Bolshevik government. So the category of refugee, which is one of the important structuring elements, appears after the First World War, but it appears in response to changing political contexts that go back earlier. Modern refugee history is born of the transition from empire to nation state, and particularly at first, the transition from dynastic empire to nation state in the years around the First World War, and then later on from colonial empire to nation state in the later part of the 20th century. But not in the sense that once empires give way to nation states, those states produce refugees. And that's one of the important ways of thinking about it, that historians of refugees and other scholars working on refugees make use of, put out by, in an influential, very influential article by Aristide Zolberg a generation ago now. Rather, I think it's true to say that from the late 19th century into the 20th, pressures of modernization in dynastic empires facing competition from the colonial empires changed the relationship between imperial states and their subject populations, intensifying the demands each made of the other, and among the different subject populations, some of which saw the state as representing them in the Ottoman Empire, for example, but also in the Russian Empire, others, and some of which saw it as illegitimate, as oppressing them, and increasingly saw it as doing that as state capacity developed and the effort to raise taxes and conscript people and so on increased. The tensions, the pressures, the conflicts that this gave rise to were a crucial part of politics within the dynastic empires through the later 19th century, and also their competition with one another and with the colonial empires as different powers tried to interfere among the subject populations of their rivals. So the conflict this gave rise to became general among the dynastic empires of Western Eurasia during the First World War. The Ottomans, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns. We should probably think about Germany as more like a dynastic empire on the Eastern Front and more like a nation state on the Western Front. And in that global conflagration of the First World War, the result was mass population displacement. But this was a process that in the Ottoman case was already well advanced before the First World War, as the Ottoman Empire was the weakest of those dynastic empires. It was under the sharpest pressure from its dynastic rivals and also from the colonial empires, British, French. And so there was already a long established process whereby subject populations were breaking away from the Ottoman Empire as the empire tried to increase the loyalty of some parts of its population, but also increasingly came to suspect the loyalties of other parts of its population. And so nationalist movements were in action all over the Ottoman Empire, but particularly in the Balkans, which is really a crucible for this kind of conflict. And then also in the Caucasus, the particular flashpoint between Russian expansion and the Ottoman Empire. And the population displacements that arose from these flashpoints of violence among among subject populations of these empires, especially the Ottoman Empire here, as well as between the imperial state and parts of the population. The displacements these gave rise to intensify the development of nationalism, intensify the efforts of imperial states to modernize. There's an interweaving of different factors going on here. Meaning that by the later 19th century, and particularly by the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in the Ottoman Empire, this process of dynastic struggle giving rise to conflicts which generate population displacement and generate nationalist movements and eventually nation states, which produce further population displacements. This is all already there in the Ottoman case.
Yeah.
Which leads to the second point. So if that kind of process of population politics in dynastic empires giving rise to displacement and nationalism and ultimately nation states at the same time is there earliest in the Ottoman case. Many of the responses that we see to population displacement and that we associate with modern refugee history, bureaucratic responses, are already present in the Ottoman Empire as well. And in fact, the bureaucratic response to incoming refugees, either from the Caucasus and Russian expansion, or from the breakaway of Ottoman provinces in the Balkans, many of the responses of the Ottoman Empire, this becomes a key part of bureaucratic modernization in the late Ottoman Empire. It's an essential part of what Karen Barkay refers to as the Ottoman road out of empire, because it drives the increasing nationalization of Ottoman politics generally. But the bureaucratic responses, including things like long-range population transfer agricultural resettlement, tax breaks, relief in cash and in kind, that go with the Ottoman reception of these refugees. Lots of these then appear in the late 19-teens and 1920s in the colonial empires, but also in the thinking and practice of the League of Nations. And so even if the legal category of refugee is not there, many of the practices of dealing with displaced populations that we associate with the refugee regime are already there in the late Ottoman period and can't be separated out from their sinister side, which is that things like the resettlement of populations and the greater understanding the empire developed of its own territory in order to resettle those people and of its own populations, that was all taking place in the context of worsening relations between the Ottoman Empire and particularly its Christian populations. And the bureaucratic capacity to resettle and allocate land to incoming refugees was flipped around during the First World War and became also part of the bureaucratic capacity to expropriate displaced and in many cases murdered Christian populations. Mm-hmm. So there's a sinister side to all this too. I don't want to say that the Ottoman Empire was simply a kind of spirit of Geneva avant la lettre in resettling refugees.
Well, and of course, you could also say that there is a sinister side to Geneva's approaches later as well, right? That this is not kind of something that's solely within the purview of the Ottoman sphere. Mm-hmm. And it's often struck me that one of the issues that we have with refugee history kind of in general is that we tend to privilege the formal internationalist aspects of refugee regimes without recognizing either precedents or later examples of refugee-related policy and even legal definitions that take place within national states rather than among them. So I'm thinking, I think you could certainly make an argument that there's a refugee regime in the late Ottoman state, that it's maybe the first state to have a refugee regime of that nature. But similarly, we tend to leave out things like South Asia at partition from our history of refugeedom because those displaced peoples were dealt with under largely national systems rather than international ones. So there are kind of later examples of the sort of thing you're talking about as well, I think.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And this is partly down to the influence over the scholarship that the articulation of the legal category of refugee has had, especially after 1951, when there's the UN Convention definition, but also a bit earlier, where it's the idea of someone having crossed a border
right.
and not having the protection of the state. It means that all of those people who are displaced but are then given the protection of the state immediately just get left out to some extent. But we definitely need to think about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about that kind of internationalism. I've often been struck and was struck again in rereading your work for today by your description of places like Baquba and other camps like it as kind of technologies that are designed for something you're calling the spatial management of people. And this is something that fits into a broader history of the rise of technocratic language in international politics, right? That the League of Nations in particular, and then the UN after it, begins to construct a language of what it's doing that claims a kind of technical expertise, an apolitical sort of technical expertise, right? It's claiming that it is removing itself from the kind of realm of politics and engaging in scientific knowledge about populations, about resettlement, about the management and engineering of communities, You know, there's this new touting of the idea of scientific solutions for all sorts of problems. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the rise of refugee policy in this immediate post-World War I period, and maybe especially the rise of refugee camps as this kind of technology of management that you're describing, how does this fit into this broader trend of internationalisms claiming a kind of neutral technocratic approach on a global scale? Is that a fair assessment? Are camps an important part of this kind of remaking of the language of internationalism?
I think probably yes. I've thought about this a bit looking into refugee camps. And I guess I haven't really then thought about looking back out from refugee camps and the extent to which techniques that are applied to refugees are then applied to other populations more generally. And that's probably an oversight and a big one on my part, because down to the present, refugees often serve as a test population for radical, innovative, and often dangerous practices of governance, which we see today with things like the biometric surveillance of refugee populations, which is more intense than non-refugee populations face, but is driven by kind of nexus of nation-state actors, tech companies, and international organizations and humanitarian agencies who are perhaps a bit naive about it, who don't realize that the practices that are being tested on refugees, such as needing to give an iris scan in order to use a cash machine, as is the case in refugee camps in Jordan, that these might be generalized to the rest of the population. I think looking back to the period we're talking about, between the wars, this is probably there, and I hadn't really thought about it. But as is often the case, camps are a good place to start thinking about it, because they're relatively restricted spaces.
Yeah.
They are contained, they are surveillable, they can be governed much more directly, and their population is much more dependent. They don't house the majority of refugees today, and there have always been significant numbers of refugees who avoided them. But it is in this period, I think, that the refugee camp, as a formal camp constructed by someone else to put refugees in, emerges. And is a governable space, and a more readily governable space, at least in imperial aspirations, than these areas of recent colonial expansion. So for the British, for example, in what they refer to as Mesopotamia, occupied the Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. Baquba, which is the camp I've written about, that housed at its height coming on to 50,000 refugees from 3 different Christian groups from Eastern Anatolia and the Caucasus, becomes like this test case for state building in miniature, I guess. And miniature is a word that you've used about that same camp, talking about it as a kind of national homeland in miniature, by which the British, at the tail end of the First World War and into the post-war period, demonstrated a kind of slightly more than rhetorical commitment to the national status of those Christian populations without actually having to create states for them. But thinking about it in miniature is useful in other ways as well. because there's a well-established theme in the literature on the modern developmental state, particularly around the work of James C. Scott, that it develops these grandiose plans for remaking human destiny, and that reality, the reality of the world and the reality natural and human, is just too messy and uncontrollable. And so there is often a retreat to the model or the miniature. And you can kind of see that at Baquba as well, where this camp built across the river from a small provincial administrative center of 3,000 people rapidly has 20 kilometers of piped water. It has a sanitation system. It has neatly laid out plots for tents housing 4 or 5 families each, 3,000 of these tents. It's surveillable, it's controllable, it's governable in a way that the occupation zone itself is not, but at an enormous cost. Running the camp at Baquba cost a sum in its first year equivalent to 2/3 of the civil revenues of the entire occupation zone. Now, at most, there were just under 50,000 people in the camp, and there were 2 or 3 million in the occupation zone. And so there's an immense channeling of resources towards the camp. It would not have been possible to do that from the civil revenues of the occupation zone. Instead, that money had to come direct from the British War Office budget. To try and make this national homeland in miniature also a governed territory in miniature. And this leads back to your point about technocratic management of displaced populations, which also works as a kind of trial run for technocratic management of other populations, trying to be apolitical. Because, or presenting itself rather as apolitical, when of course it's always intensely political. It's possible, or the refugee camp itself served in a way to turn the people living into it into humanitarian objects rather than political subjects in their own right. The way the British archival sources are constructed, the way narratives about the camp, like the book about it by its first commander, H.H. Austin, the way these present the camp, they present the people in it as humanitarian objects of pity and assistance. And they tend to downplay their politics. But of course, there was intense politicization within the camp, of the camp's relationship with the area, the people around it, and of the camp's place in imperial politics, which keeps breaking through in the archival sources. So at the level of the imperial government, as I said, this camp was being funded direct from the War Office budget. It cost a hell of a lot of money. I think it was 2 or 3 million pounds sterling in its first year at a time when Britain was bankrupt. And so unsurprisingly, questions were asked in Parliament about why Britain was spending so much money on a group of helpless refugees. But also, partly because of that, the camp authorities tried to stimulate economic activity in the camp and try to get the refugees out doing contract labor and so on, try to get them grazing their flocks, selling their produce. Sending them out of the camp increased the possibilities for friction between them and the host population. And the host population anyway was living under an unwanted military occupation, which they could see was allocating vastly more resources to the refugees than it was allocating to them. Political tensions there were enormous. And then what to do with the refugees who themselves didn't want to hang around and just be humanitarian objects, but had plenty of ideas of their own about where and how they wanted to live. All of this meant that the camp could not produce a passive humanitarian population. It was constantly intensely politicized. This reached a point of crisis in the summer of 1920 when the uprising against British rule in central Mesopotamia took place. And at this point, the camp's military origins and the military use that the British had already made of some of the refugees immediately snapped it back from its humanitarian function to a military one. The political officer from the town of Baquba quickly ran across the bridge into the camp because the town was uncontrollable, but the camp was a bastion of British military authority. And from the camp, and using refugees armed and mounted by the British, colonial control could be reasserted. So this has gone quite a long way from your original question, but it shows, I think, probably that there'd be a lot of mileage in thinking about refugee camps and refugee policy more generally in the Middle East in the 20s and 30s, or from 1918 on, as test cases for technocratic management, and also as examples of how the technocratic claim, especially around humanitarian objects, populations constructed as suffering objects of humanitarian assistance. The technocratic claim to render those techniques of government apolitical always run up against politics.
Yeah.
I hope
And
that
maybe,
makes some kind of sense.
no, I think so. And maybe also sort of are deliberately designed to obscure some of the political interests. I mean, I think the claim that any of these kinds of policies are neutral, is belied by all of the sources at every level. I mean, in the case of Baquba, I think, there's a clear kind of potential answer to the question of why the British spent so much money maintaining this camp, which is that they, had used and had plans to further use these populations as colonial militias, which is in fact, became one of the building blocks of the British presence in Iraq over the course of the interwar period.
Absolutely.
And it's far from the only example. We have a very similar unfolding of refugee policy in Syria, where the French make use of Armenian refugees in colonial militaries. And it's a theme that comes up, I think, again and again, and it's not an unfamiliar one in the post-war period, where we often see military elements to the construction of camps, the use of military materiel, the use of soldiers to engage in this kind of supposedly humanitarian work. I wonder if you think that we need to make more space in refugee history, kind of generally, for the inclusion of the understanding of military strategy as part of what makes up this kind of theoretically, not just technocratic, but humanitarian policy across the globe. In other words, is this kind of very, very close, uncomfortably close relationship between military approaches, tactics, personnel, and humanitarian aid in the interwar Middle East? Is this something that we can extend outward into other sorts of refugee histories?
Yeah, I think it is. The colonial secretary's response to that question about why so much money was being spent on these refugees was very brief, 3 words: our honorable obligations. And that was Churchill, by the way, if I remember rightly. But you're right that there's obviously much more going on than a sense of obligation or simply a desire to provide humanitarian assistance. I'm not sure whether we need to think particularly about the military history of the refugee regime and practices of responding to refugees specifically or whether it's more a case that we need to look at the military origins of many humanitarian practices. That's a point I make in the article about the evacuation of Armenians from Cilicia in 1921. I think it is straightforwardly the case that the techniques of long-range movement of large numbers of troops that had developed by 1914-18 were simply applied to a humanitarian end that they had not been applied to before. And if we want to understand how that became practicable, looking at military logistics is the answer, or at least an important part of the answer. And I think that that is also the case for the refugee camp. I think Baquba, not just from the tents that housed its inhabitants, which were a British Army of India model, but the whole assemblage of logistical techniques that meant people could be kept there and kept alive, if not indefinitely, then certainly for years rather than months. I think this again has its origins in the military camps of the First World War era, and I think when we think about this, we can sometimes, the way humanitarian practices often have these military origins, and even much later on, when they're not necessarily carried out by militaries themselves, so humanitarian evacuations often draw on military forces, military logistics, but even when they're not carried out by militaries themselves, they often involve people who have come direct from military experience, and so on. In the 1940s and 50s, that's evident. And in some ways, we can often see a kind of coercive streak in humanitarian politics, which tends to try and bury itself a little bit, but is often very near the surface and immediately obvious to you if you're a refugee. And I think we can trace that out a bit as well. I was just rereading something about Baquba yesterday, about the way the tents at that camp had to have their sides rolled back each morning to wear the camps out, except for the side facing the wind. And if you didn't do this, the British officer who came around to inspect the tents would withdraw your ration, withdraw the tent's ration card for the day. So yeah, the coercive element is there from the military discipline, I guess. Whether it's specific to the refugee regime, I don't really know. We can certainly see in other aspects the military roots of the refugee regime from the prisoner of war transfers at the end of the First World War, and again, clearly the direct correspondence. Fridtjof Nansen, who'd been appointed to assist, to kind of coordinate the extremely complicated task of exchanging many hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war particularly across Central and Eastern Europe, who had been fighting for empires that no longer existed and had to be returned to places that in many cases they'd never been anywhere near. It was Nansen's diplomatic and technical expertise developed through carrying out that role and doing so successfully and cheaply that led to his appointment as High Commissioner. And again, I think this thing where the practice of moving hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, again, is one of the things going on to normalize population displacement and normalize population displacement as a solution. Yeah, as you've written about. So that's an indirect military origin to the refugee regime as well. Otherwise, I think there's plenty more we could explore in this.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and this is leading me to something that I wanted to ask you about. I think when we talk about, the military origins of these humanitarian regimes and the kind of the institutional mechanics of these kinds of movements of peoples and their resettlement, we're also looking at a problem at a really deeply seated source and methodology problem that historians of refugee studies face, right? And that is that militaries leave behind records, and international institutions leave behind records, and humanitarian aid organizations leave behind records. And refugees themselves often find that it's better not to leave records, right? That it's a common refugee experience that disappearing from the formal record is advantageous in lots of respects. So as historians, we have a real problem where voices of refugees themselves tend to get lost in these refugee narratives, right? In these refugee histories. So how do you think, as historians, what are some possible workarounds? What are ways to hear the voices of refugees themselves and understand their own narratives and their own, literal and figurative journeys through these experiences? Are there kind of methodological processes that we should be looking to as historians to explore these sorts of narratives?
Yeah, I think there definitely are. And it's worth noting that, you're right that at times refugees find it advantageous to disappear from the official record, I guess. But also the obvious case that the refugee archive, if you like, is fragmentary. The papers and so on, the possessions, the material objects that refugees can bring with them, obviously limited. It's hard to constitute a family archive going back through violent displacements. It's also really striking, though, especially for this period, but up to the present, that refugees get disappeared from those institutional archives. And I say it's striking. It really struck me when I started working on the history of refugees in the Middle East between the wars, having already written a book about the French mandate in Syria. Because when I was researching that book, in the French archives, the voices of the colonized population are there all over the place, right? There are evident problems with the way the archives are structured. There's evidently a kind of archival disciplining of colonized voices and the ways in which they're allowed to enter the archive that reflects and is structured by the way the colonial states in Syria and Lebanon, in Iraq, were willing to be spoken to, if you like, by the populations they ruled over. Nonetheless, you can find any number of letters, of petitions, of telegrams, and any number of examples of interactions with favored interlocutors in particular. And that's just not there with the refugee populations. It's hardly there at all for the Armenian populations that ended up being evacuated from Cilicia, and who really forced the French to evacuate them, if you like, by recognizing that the safeguards the French said they'd put in place for the handover of that region to the Ankara government were meaningless. And so they were leaving despite the fact, in their tens of thousands, despite the fact that the French had told them to stay. It's clearly that exodus, and then the fact that getting on for 30,000 other people who didn't have the means to leave just gathered at the railhead at Dirt Yard and at the port of Mersin and waited. That just made it impossible for the French to leave them. So it's driven by what those people are choosing to do. The French archives contain no to my knowledge anyway, that I've encountered, no documents produced by those people at all, and hardly any examples of direct communication between those people and French personnel. Similarly, in the research I've done on the camp at Baquba under the British occupation, the only two accounts or documents produced by refugees that I've encountered in British sources, one is a kind of vote of thanks by an Assyrian priest that's reprinted in a memoir or the account of the camp by its former commandant. The other is a letter written by an Assyrian leader, Sulma Khanum, when she was in London. So she wasn't even in the camp. There's very little that gives a sense of how the people in the camp organized themselves politically, or even how they were governed politically by the British. There's a reference here and there to the different sections and the headquarters they had, but there's no record of how that went about. Which means that, especially for this period, getting at refugees' experiences, learning what they felt about it is particularly hard. We're back before the period where oral history is possible. And we're not talking about populations really that encountered oral history by the time it got going later on in the 20th century. So there's an awful lot of oral history, say in Britain. If you go to the British Library oral history archives and search for refugees, most of the results you'll get are for kinder transport children who came to Britain and were interviewed in the later 20th century. I don't think that's possible for the examples I'm studying. But then, especially where Armenian refugees are concerned, Armenians are a highly literate population. I'm sure that there are memoirs available in Armenian, which I can't read, but others can. I know that Victoria Abrahamian, a PhD researcher at Neuchâtel, is working now on some of the issues that I've looked at in ways that will enable her to go way beyond what I've done, because she's Armenian and can read the available Armenian sources. Otherwise, we have family archives, perhaps, oral history for more recent cases, and published refugee narratives. The ones that I use in my teaching don't relate to these cases we've been talking about, but they include the wonderful memoir by the Russian writer Tefi of her flight from Moscow in 1919. Laura Segal's beautiful book, Other People's Houses, about being a kinder transport refugee in Britain in the 30s and 40s. And then examples that come into the more recent past. Marie-Béatrice Umutesi's narrative of flight from Rwanda in the mid-90s, and some Vietnamese refugee narratives. These are crucial sources for understanding refugee history more generally, though it's also important to take them as sophisticated literary narratives and think about them on their own terms, not simply accept them at face value as factual documents. And narratives that are often shaped by all sorts of other forces, including the force of literary genre. Many more recent refugee narratives are shaped, and evidently shaped, by asylum interviews, by the need to construct a coherent narrative for deployment in the asylum process, as the asylum process across the rich world has become more hostile. So there are plenty of examples of that kind of thing for the recent past, which give us opportunities to get more of a sense of refugees' own experiences, but also present their own methodological challenges. Oral history interviews, for example, I'm supervising a PhD on oral histories of refugee lives in Scotland, but it's not easy to go and interview people who have been interviewed repeatedly by people who are hostile to them in the course of their experience as refugees. So great care is needed.
Yeah.
No, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm being told we're going to open up to questions. Is that correct?
Okay, great. So we have quite a few questions. The first from Azamat, 2 questions. Were there any anti-refugee policies of what we consider the developed countries during the 20th century? And then what is the main difference between being a refugee in the 20th century and being a refugee today? These are very broad, but if...
There sure are. Anti-refugee policies definitely present in every instance, and yeah, I mean, one of the kind of paradigmatic examples would be the world, but particularly Europe in the 1930s in response to refugees from Nazi Germany. Which is, of course, something that the Nazis were exploiting by producing a refugee crisis. They knew that it would destabilize politics in receiving states. It was quite deliberate. There are all sorts of other examples. If I was asked what the main difference between being a refugee during the 20th century and now is, that partly because of the catastrophic failure of the refugee regime in the late 1930s and 40s, from the middle of the 20th century, there was a generalized international effort to do better and to assist refugees, which social democratic welfare states in the West, newly independent, modernizing nation states with their own state building projects in the global South, and to some extent communist states in the East, all offered ways of incorporating refugees, though always under strict terms or whatever. And that is something that has ebbed away steadily since the 1970s, with the debt crises in the global South that undermines state building projects there, with the related austerity politics and rise of neoliberalism in the global North, and the dismantlement of welfare states in the global North, and with the end of communism in Eastern Europe. We've seen, especially in recent years, that there's much less international will to assist refugees, even though, and I say this contrary to the frequently repeated claim that there are more refugees than ever, that it's a bigger problem than that, the world has a vastly greater capacity to assist refugees now than it had in 1951, and as a proportion of the global population, the number of people who are displaced generally, let alone the smaller group who are refugees, is much smaller now than it was then.
I'll just add a couple of things to that, which is that I think that when we talk about anti-refugee policies in the 20th century, that one of the ways that manifested itself, especially among the European empires, was the decision to place refugees when possible in colonial spaces. And so we can see that in the Middle East, but it happens in other places as well. And that one of the consequences of that is that host societies often become quite hostile to refugee settlements because they conceive of them as part of a process of colonial occupation, correctly, I would argue. And so we have kind of, multiple layers of this, the manifestations and iterations and venues for this kind of anti-refugee sentiment that trickles down across various levels of the European imperial project, and that happens throughout the 20th century, well into the era of decolonization. And just to add a little bit more as well to the kind of, decline of the refugee assistance system since the 1970s, that one of the manifestations of that has been the proliferation of categories of temporary residency, of work permits, that there of levels of belonging and levels of citizenship, that one of the institutional characteristics of the global system over the past 40, 50 years has been that we have more and more and more subcategories of asylum and of labor migration and of travel and migration and work permits, and that those numbers of categories are themselves an indicator of the increasing reluctance of the international community to offer genuine refugee aid. I think that's one of the ways we can tell that that's happening.
Yeah, and just to pick up on one thing you mentioned there's a really interesting dynamic that has been going on in Europe in the last 15 or 20 years, whereby people hostile to the European Union have seen refugees in the same kind of light as people that Europe is resettling here against our will. That was transparent in the Brexit referendum campaign, and is clearly visible in many other European states as well. Yeah. Interesting.
Great, thank you. That was really wonderful. Could you expand a bit more on the place of the Middle East within broader international refugee histories? What, if anything, is distinctive about refugee history in the Middle East?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I think part of what I'm trying to get at with my research is to argue that it's not distinctive, but that frequently it is an origin point for practices and for political phenomena that then appear elsewhere. Yeah, as to whether it is then particularly distinctive, I'm not so sure. Laura, do you want to?
Well, there's a follow-up question that actually might, which is very similar to this, which might help, from another guest. David asks, don't you think that the standard refugee historiography ignores fundamental historical developments outside of Europe and underplays the Middle East, in part because of the shifting divisions between the very regional labels of Europe and the Middle East, and the difficulty of placing the Ottoman Empire within a capacious definition of tidal Europe?
Say there are a couple of separate issues here. And one is the question of kind of where and when refugeedom begins. And I think that you could part of what Ben's work is doing, and other historians as well, is suggesting that the Ottoman Empire is kind of ground zero for the way that these multinational imperial formulations dissolve into nation states in ways, and through those processes, people who become refugees are kind of constituting borders in new ways. And that I think there is a real argument for saying that the Middle East is the first and most visible place where that happens, and that we can see the kind of expansion of those patterns elsewhere. I would point out, though, that in terms of, I'm generally of the mind that it's important to de-exceptionalize the narrative of the Middle East in world history, that we too often think of it as a place where, there are kind of categories of politics, for instance, that don't apply elsewhere. However, I do think it's important, something that we have not mentioned here because it falls outside of the time frame that Ben is discussing, but we do need to acknowledge that Palestine is in some ways an exceptional case within the global refugee regime, that it has a separate international legal structure associated with the populations that fall under UNRWA's, UNRWA's kind of purview, and that is a case that has been deliberately constructed to be exceptional for a variety of reasons that serve, I would argue, other kinds of internationalist approaches to governing Europe and governing the Middle East and thinking about global political systems in general. So I think there is an argument to be made that is a kind of exceptional aspect of Middle Eastern refugee history, but also that even there we need to make sure that we're connecting that history into developments elsewhere, and to understand that there are global reasons and internationalist reasons that Palestine is constituted as the kind of unique refugee problem that we see.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and I think so would the person asking the question and Irfan. To go to offer one other thought about the standard refugee historiography and its neglect of the Middle East, it's very important to recognize that the European powers of the 19th century were in up to their necks in the displacement of Muslims from the Caucasus, from the Balkans, into the Middle East. Displacement often in extremely violent contexts, and that they viewed it as a wholly good thing, right? And that the modern discipline of history emerged in these European powers at the same time, and has inherited their understanding of the world in all sorts of ways, just as so for example, thinking about Muslims as refugees is something that was not done in the 20s and 30s. And when the mandatory powers in the Middle East were talking about refugees, they always meant Christians. The idea that a Muslim could be a refugee, the category was not yet capacious enough to take that in. The 19th century European attitudes to the Ottoman Empire, the assumption that it would and must disappear, and that Muslim populations would and must disappear from Europe. These shape the historiography down to the present, partly in the lack of linguistic skills and so on among Europeanists to even consider the Ottoman case. So there's a really complex thing going on, which continues to shape the refugee historiography, I think, especially for that period around 1900. A willingness to see Muslims, for example, as perpetrators, which some undoubtedly were, and an unwillingness to understand them as victims, as refugees.
Thank you. We have two very sort of specific research related questions that you both might be well placed to answer. The first is if you could comment on health measures or the lack of health measures in camps, and if there are good statistics on death rates during the early period. And the second question is there a list of the Baquba attendees, and are there any records that may reveal where people moved after 1920?
I'll answer that question first because it's easier. No. And that's not the case for the evacuation from Cilicia in 1921. There, at least by family group, we have the names of the people who were evacuated, at least for those who were evacuated by sea. For Baquba, if those records were ever kept, they don't exist. There are some details on health measures and on the health situation of the refugees, which was at first catastrophic. 50 or 60 people dying per day when the camp's population had only reached 20,000, falling off to something like 30 a day when its population, which is still way higher than what modern humanitarian practice considers acceptable levels, by the time it had reached its peak of population in 1919, and then declining quite rapidly thereafter, most obviously because the people living in it had shelter, chlorinated drinking water, and enough food to eat, as well as firewood, all issued by the occupation forces. But also because of medical interventions, which included isolation and fumigation on arrival in the camp, and then the establishment of hospitals and health checks as well. So intense medical regimes, and also veterinary. I've worked quite a bit on animals in the camp, but particularly medically, to make sure that the people were not starving anymore, and then were less vulnerable to the diseases that were killing tens of thousands of people around the Middle East at this time, typhus in particular.
It might be, I don't have a lot to add to that, but it's worth noting that what we know about Baquba mostly comes from narrative accounts, that we don't have the kind of, these kinds of details of, for instance, how many people are dying per day, as far as I have seen anyway, come from narrative accounts of people who were commanders in the camp, not from the kind of statistical record keeping that we might expect from a kind of later form of this sort of encampment. So it is a bit informal. And I would also add that those records and those narratives are also drawing on records of, most of the people who were in the camp had come on a long journey by foot, from the borderland areas. And so part of what they were recording was loss of life along the way, and the consequences of that once people were settled into the camp. And so I think it's a little bit difficult to say exactly what the conditions in the camp itself can't really be separated from the experiences of the population prior to their arrival, and it is quite a short-lived moment as well.
Yeah. Though this is actually, it is an important point. A colleague of mine, a historian of medicine, has pointed out that if I remember rightly from this conversation, there's an important role in the development of understandings of nutrition for the liberation of the concentration camps in the 1940s. The British in particular found themselves in command of camps containing people who were in a state that we can't imagine, right? A state of starvation and disease. And so the camps were liberated, but thousands upon thousands of people in them continued to die. And the British had to turn scientific and social scientific methods to these camps to demonstrate that the people dying were dying as a result of what had happened before the liberation, and not because they weren't being sufficiently well looked after. There's an element of that going on at Baquba. I don't think that the military medical knowledge that was established in this way was as formalized, partly because the numbers are much smaller. I don't think it was then transmitted in the way that knowledge developed in the 1940s was. And there is some, the reports on the camps, on the camp, the monthly reports on it. Some of them are still available there. They're incomplete, but I found they do include some of this kind of statistical record keeping. but it's quite a while since I actually looked at those. And there's also a war diary of the senior medical officer, which I'd need to go back, which is not a kind of statistical document. It's more a kind of just note by the person in that role across the years of the camp's existence, which is several different people, about key events happening each day. But that could just include, say, when the camp was being set up, visiting the site, noting that there were enough of these mosquitoes everywhere, and sending around a memo about mosquito nets. It's not the kind of tabular information.
Okay, we have just about 3 minutes, so I think time maybe for one final question. This question is from Heba. She says, to return to the question of periodization, I am wondering how the longer historical view of contemporary refugees in Arab cities can help us understand what remains of other genealogies of refugee aid. For instance, I find from my own research that the experience of Palestinian and Syrian refugees in Amman cannot be disconnected from those of the late 19th century Ottoman Circassian refugees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually a very important point, and it's relevant to Ben's work on the camp itself, because camps are often repurposed for the next group of refugees. So that's true, for instance, for some Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon that were originally Armenian settlements. And I do think this is something that there is room for considerable scholarly growth in this area, right? To think about a kind of narrative of refugeedom that goes through different national groups who become refugees in specific places. And it might also be worth thinking about certain places as becoming kind of spaces where refugeedom is replicated over and over and over again as a consequence of different historical circumstances and political circumstances, but in the same geographical realms. So I think it's actually a very kind of fruitful venue for further scholarly inquiry.
I agree, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do with my work on the history of the refugee camp, is to develop the methodology of site biographies, because for all sorts of reasons there is often a tendency for people and perhaps also for refugees themselves to be, of course, they're more interested in their own experiences, or for historians to be interested in the experiences of one particular group and not always recognize that those experiences are shaped by a site which has witnessed earlier and subsequent displaced populations. And not just displaced populations. The site where I've done most work for this is actually in the southwest of France at Rivesaltes, which serves as a military transit camp, a refugee camp, an internment camp for undesirables, a prisoner of war camp, migrant hostel, an immigration detention center, and now as a museum, a memorial of encampment. And that's just a quick, a quick summary. It's actually a bit more complicated than that. So exploring these specific sites is really important, and also thinking about what happens differently between camps that are set up in isolated areas, and perhaps particularly camps that are set up by other people for refugees, or used to house refugees. Rivesaltes is an example of that. And camps that are set up, self-settled encampments, and particularly, and this is the case with many of the Palestinian camps, but with preludes in Circassian and Armenian examples, camps that are at the edges of urban areas and become urbanized rapidly themselves. Lots to explore there in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Thank you both so much. We did have one hand from someone who I think might be calling in from a phone, and so is unable to use the chat. But I've been trying to unmute them. Oh, here it is. Okay. Heike, would you like to ask your question, your final brief question?
I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you very much. My question was about the concentration camps that existed in earlier period, 1915, 1917, during the Armenian genocide, because the death marches and the wholesale massacres are the more known part of the Armenian genocide. But looks like the concentration camps are kind of still need to be studied. Murad Yankarchik did some research, I know. So I was wondering if these camps came under your kind of attention during the research. Thank you.
They haven't come under mine, and that's partly because I haven't focused specifically on the Armenian genocide. You know, I've worked on the period of its aftermath, and especially places where Armenians who'd survived ended up, but not on the sites of genocide itself. Though I don't know, maybe that's not a satisfactory answer. Maybe I should have thought more. For example, I haven't encountered any references to this in the French sources about what was happening in Deir ez-Zor, which is the town that is the destination for many of the death marches, and which ends up in French mandate Syria. And what the situation there was like as the French arrived, for example, and whether they found any encampments, or whether genocide survivors who'd outlived Ottoman control in the region had already made their way to Aleppo or Beirut or other places. But I haven't studied this at all, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think it does point to an important kind of broader question, which is that, you know, the extent to which refugee camp regimes often rest on military sorts of camps and concentration camps, places of internment, right? And that's true. That's something that is also true in a number of different instances across the 20th century, including during and after the Second World War. You know, and the kind of eventual manifestation of these places in displaced person camps for European Jews. So I think it's actually quite a common experience, and one that perhaps refugee historians should think about more, that internment camps and concentration camps can in fact be a physical basis for later refugee regimes and regimes of encampment and enclosure. So it's perhaps a good note to end on, that this is something that would be worth kind of greater investigation as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Thank you so much for such a rich conversation, Laura and Benjamin. We really appreciate you joining us, and as demonstrated by the number of questions that we haven't even been able to address, there's obviously great interest in your research. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. Shayna, thank you for moderating the questions, and I just want to remind you all to join us again in 2 weeks on March 4th for the next event in our lecture series, The Government of Pearling, A Social History of Law in the Arabian Gulf from 1860 to 1950 with Dr. Alexander Cairo and our own Dr. Nathan Brown. So thank you so much for joining us, and everybody stay safe.
Thank you
So much.